Welcome back to another episode of the PigX Podcast. I'm your host, Delaney Howell. Litter sizes on commercial swine farms continue to grow across the nation. However, the number of functional teats has not kept pace with the increase, a challenge that today's episode will talk about from a recent research trial. Joining us today are Abigail Jenkins, a graduate research assistant in applied swine nutrition at Kansas State University, and Dr. Joel DeRouchey, a professor at K-State and the university's State Extension Program leader in animal science. Today, we're diving deeper into the findings from a commercial sow farm in Texas. Using a sample size of just over 1,000 pigs, this study examined sow body condition loss, piglet and litter growth, removals and mortality rates, and the subsequent reproduction. We also discuss how producers can apply this information to their own operations. But before we dive into this data, let's hear a bit more about Abigail's background and connection to the swine industry.
So I was really fortunate enough to grow up on a small family show operation. So we had show cattle and show pigs, and my family actually still raises show pigs back at home in South Louisiana. We have about 20 sows, and so I was exposed to animal agriculture at a really young age and really thankful for that. And so when it was time for me to go to college, I decided to go to Mississippi State and get a degree in animal science there. And during that time was when I really got the opportunity to get exposure to some commercial systems. So I got to intern with Prestige Farms and got to spend a little bit of time with the mash-offs. And so through those opportunities, I really fell in love with commercial swine production and ultimately decided to go get a master's in reproductive physiology with Dr. Flowers at North Carolina State. And my work there really focused on colostrum intake and what factors impact both colostrum quality and intake. And that subject matter really lent itself to the nutrition by reproduction interaction. And so I learned a lot about some nutrition parts during that time in my life and really developed a passion for nutrition and how we can benefit the pig through what we feed them. And so I decided to pursue a PhD at Kansas State in applied swine nutrition, and I've been here for about 3 years. So I'm closing in on the end of my time at K-State.
So to start, tell us how this idea for the research came together.
So we're really lucky that we get to partner with different industry partners through research, and this was something that we knew was really important to the industry as we think about the fact that number born alive is constantly increasing as we select for this highly prolific sow, which is good because the more pigs born alive means more pigs out the door, and hopefully more pigs making it to market. But we have to consider that the number of functional teats has not increased at the same rate that our number of pigs born alive. And so that's something that the industry as a whole is really dealing with, is having more pigs than they have teats to put these pigs on. And so they either have to rely on a heavy use of nurse sows, or they have to consider what the impacts are of nursing more pigs than functional teats. And so this was something that we discussed with some of our industry partners. It was really important to them. And ultimately, that's one of the goals of our group, is when we see a need, we try to do some research to see what some potential solutions are. And that's kind of how this trial came about.
So Joel, can you start by giving us an overview of how this project came to be?
Yeah, one of the things we're very fortunate on our pig livability project is really to be able to partner with different production systems to help answer questions around pig livability. And as Abigail's talked about, trying to understand, and as we look at pre-weaning mortality, these our current maternal sows are have such potential for the number of pigs born, the amount of milk they produce, and really it kind of came back to the fundamental questions on farm as groups of sows are farrowing and cross fostering's occurring and we're transferring pigs, is how do we best transfer these pigs to different sows to maximize potential livability or piglet quality, and oftentimes these sows may just not have enough we're having more pigs born alive than some of the sows have functional mammatory glands. And so, but that may not always be a negative in terms of if those pigs, if there's not a functional teat for each pig on that sow. And so basically there's very lack of data. And so we can always do observational, and there's a lot of good information generated by individual sow farms trying to do observational information. This was really an attempt to get some good solid data behind one of these practices, and I guess that's really what spurred the discussion as we look at pig livability and ultimately profitability for these sow operations, production systems. And so that's what started some of the discussions. We have some base funding through this project to help with the labor side, and then the production system, in this case JBS, they fully provided the facilities, the extra labor on site, all the things, and we can jointly do this project to generate information for the industry.
Joel, share a little bit more too about some of the commercial partners or on-farm collaborators that played a key role in making this project happen.
Yeah, so again, yeah, really the partners in this would have been the swine livability project itself, then JBS Live Pork, as well as PIC help with some resources in terms of labor, also some financial interest to help with this particular project. So it really was a group collaboration between those, and of course, Kansas State being involved as well from the coordination side, but also our partners at Iowa State who are part of this project as well. So really, it takes a large group effort, and I'm very fortunate to have a large team to pull off these very large and complicated sow commercial studies.
So your study in particular focused on functional teat count. Can you define what that is and why that distinction was critical for this study?
So, functional teat classification can be a little subjective depending on who you talk to. For us, the way that we define functional teat in the context of this study is that the teat produces enough milk to sustain the life of a piglet. It also has to be elongated with no visual defects, and it ultimately can be suckled by the piglet. And so, it's really important that when we consider the amount of milk production potential that a sow has, that we consider only functional teats, because we know that any blind teats or blunt teats or teats connected to mammary glands with severe edema are not going to be able to sustain the life of a piglet and should not be counted towards that sow. And so that was something that was really important to us. And so in order to keep that consistent across the whole study, the same individual would have done functional teat count on all 1,005 sows included in this trial. And also importantly, functional teat count was determined after each sow farrowed. And that comes into play because if we determine the number of functional teats at that point, she's already producing milk. And so we know which mammary glands are once again producing enough milk to sustain the life of a piglet.
Why was it important to study then also loading strategies in a commercial setting versus just a controlled research farm environment?
At the end of the day, we really get a tremendous amount of value from doing these types of studies on a commercial sow farm. There is definitely something to be said for a very controlled study here at Kansas State or another university, because once again, you have more control and you can work with things in that way. But as far as the goal of this trial, we talked about, the issue that we're faced with in the industry. Ultimately, this trial was geared towards giving the industry tools to better production. And so to do a trial like this on a commercial farm just adds that much more value to it, because we've proven that these treatments can be carried out in a commercial setting. I got the opportunity to work with a phenomenal sow farm crew while I was conducting this trial. They were truly, couldn't have done it without them, but it just goes to show you that this these loading strategies can be carried out on a commercial farm, and it just brings that much more validity and to the results that we saw from this trial.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the results here in a second, but Abigail, can you give us kind of the rundown of how the project was set up and designed, and maybe walk us through some of those high-level results that you did see after completing it?
Yes. So we used 1,005 sows on a commercial farm in Northwest Texas, and these would have been PIC line 1050 sows with an average parity of about 3.5. And the way that we conducted this trial is that at the time of entry into the farrowing house, we would have collected the sow's body weight and other body condition measurements such as caliper score and back fat. And then after each sow was done farrowing, then she was allotted to treatment. And so we waited until she had completed farrowing and allotted that sow to treatment. And the way that we did the allotment was to balance both parity and entry body condition of that sow. And it was really important to us to keep both of those factors in mind, because we know that parity and body condition can play a huge role in the way that a sow performs during lactation. And so sows were allotted to one of 4 treatments. She was either loaded at 1 less pig than functional teats, the same number of pigs as functional teats, 1 more pig than functional teats, or 2 more pigs than functional teats. And so we had 4 different treatments, all relative to functional teat count. It is important to note that for this trial, any pigs that were born weighing less than 2 pounds were cross-fostered onto different litters to get specialized care. And so those sows with these small piglets were not included in the study. And also when we did the cross-fostering, only our average body weight pigs were cross-fostered to keep our normal distribution of weights within the litter. And so just in terms of high-level results, what we saw is that as we increase litter size relative to functional teat count, we see that there is an increase in pre-weaning mortality and removals. So removals being any fall behind pigs that were removed starting at about day 3 of lactation. And so these pigs would have been those that were gaunt in appearance, the ones that you could start to see that they had an empty belly, that they were not being successful in nursing, they were removed. And so there was an increase in removals and mortality as we increased that litter size relative to functional teat count, but this happened at a diminishing rate. And so that means that the increase in removals and mortality was the biggest when we increased from 1 less pig than functional teats to the same number of pigs as functional teats. And then after that point, our differences between treatments got smaller. Also, the increase in removals and mortality didn't happen at the same rate that our initial litter size increased. And so while there was more removals and mortality, we still ended up with larger litters at weaning as we increased the number of pigs nursing relative to functional teat count. From a piglet perspective, the pigs that were on sows with more pigs than functional teats would have weaned at a little bit of a lighter weight. And so we did see a decrease in weaning weight as we increased the number of pigs nursing. But really one of the big findings of this trial is that even in our +2 sows, they were still weaning pigs that were heavier than 13.5 pounds on average. And so they were still weaning a really healthy, good-sized pig. They would have just been smaller than the pigs weaned from sows nursing 1 less pig than functional teats. But from a litter weaning weight perspective, we still saw an increase in litter weaning weight as we increased the number of pigs nursing relative to functional teat count. So those differences in piglet weaning weight weren't enough to make up for the increases in litter size there at weaning. And then from a sow perspective, as we would have expected prior to starting this trial, we did see that sows that had more pigs nursing than functional teats did have an increase in body condition loss over lactation. But it's really important to note with this that our +2 sows only lost about 8 more pounds than our -1 sows. And so in the grand scheme of things, when we think about how large our modern sow is, 8 pounds is not a tremendous amount. And so while they did lose more caliper scores and more back fat, it wasn't a tremendous amount more. And so then ultimately, when we looked at subsequent reproduction of these sows, we would have expected to see some negative impacts on subsequent reproduction, particularly in our parity 1 sows, because we know that those gilts are more susceptible to issues when they have an increase in body condition loss over lactation. But we actually didn't see negative impacts on subsequent reproduction. And so when we think about percentage of sows bred by day 7 and subsequent farrowing rate, there were no differences based on treatment on those subsequent reproductive measurements. And actually, we saw that when we looked at the subsequent litter size, that our +2 sows actually had on average 1.2 more pigs live born in the subsequent litter than our -1 sows. And so in some ways, subsequent reproduction was actually even a little bit improved when we increased that litter size relative to teat count.
Abigail, was there anything that surprised you or any unexpected findings as you looked back through the data?
One of the things that we were really passionate about investigating further and was really important when we talked through things with those in the industry was really determining if there were differences between parity groups and how they performed, because we know that physiologically sows perform differently based on what parity they are. And so we would have grouped sows in different groups. So we would have had a group of gilts, and then parity 2 to parity 4 would have been a group, and parity 5+ would have been a group. And so honestly, we went into the trial expecting that there would at least be some differences in the response to treatment as we increased litter size based on our parity categories. And we actually didn't see that. And so that was a little bit of a surprising finding, is that we didn't have any significant differences to the treatments based on their parity grouping.
In this research trial, no supplemental nutrition was provided. Can you explain the reasoning behind that decision?
Yes. So we did not offer any supplemental milk or creep during the trial. And this is in part due to the normal operating procedure of the farm that we were on. But it was also really important to us that we see actually what that sow on her own can do. Without any supplementation, how are we going to impact performance? And so once we know how the sow can perform on her own, then we can better investigate, will there be an improvement in weaning weight or survivability if we add supplemental milk or creep feed? But it's really important to have a good baseline first before we answer those other questions. And there's also some things that we have to consider whenever we think about supplemental nutrition, especially in the context of biosecurity. So we know that some of the creep feeders and other things that we would put in the crate are a bit more challenging to get properly disinfected. And so there is an increased risk there of potentially having some health challenges in the farrowing house when we introduce some of these supplemental nutrition. And so that's a decision that each producer has to make. But really, it all came down to we wanted to know what the sow can do on her own before we looked at any type of supplemental nutrition with these differing litter sizes.
And just to clarify, earlier you mentioned litter size at weaning. With that increase, are you primarily seeing more small pigs, or is the entire litter size growing uniformly?
So that's a really good point, and that was definitely a big concern for many when we got started on this trial was, okay, let's say in the end we do increase litter size, but are we just increasing those little pigs that ultimately don't have as much value out of the farrowing house? And so To investigate this, we would have broken pigs into different body weight categories at weaning and looked at and compared the 4 treatments there. And so when we look at the proportion of the pigs weaned in the litter in these different body weight categories, in our -1 sows, the sows that were nursing 1 less pig than functional teats, we do see that they do wean a lower percentage of pigs weaned less than 2 pounds, or excuse me, less than 10 pounds, and a greater percentage of pigs weaned greater than 16 pounds. But if we don't consider our -1 treatment, and if we just look at teat count and above, we really didn't see any significant differences there in the proportion of the litter weaned in each body weight category. And so really what that tells us is that as we increase litter size relative to functional teat count, we are increasing our litter size at weaning, but we're not just increasing those small pigs that are less than 8 pounds or less than 10 pounds. We're keeping the normal distribution of body weights at weaning and just increasing the number of pigs in general.
That's a good point actually to make. There are a lot of PigX listeners that are located here in the Midwest. Since this study was conducted at a commercial farm in Texas, are there any site-specific challenges that might differ from what producers here in the Midwest typically experience?
I would say that going into it, many probably thought that it was going to be a lot warmer there than some of our other Midwestern farms. It was in the summer. And so you would expect in Texas in the summer that it gets pretty hot. I don't know if we were just fell on a pretty mild summer or what. Maybe it's also because I'm from South Louisiana, but temperature wise, we were all pretty comfortable, sows included. And so that was a challenge that we anticipated going into it, but it actually wasn't too bad. And when you think about Northwest Texas, it's pretty dry there. And so I would say that the cool cells work pretty efficiently in an environment like that. And so I would say that yes, there can be some differences, especially depending on which location in the country you are, but ultimately, I would say that the results of this trial would be ones that would translate across the country pretty well.
We've covered a lot about the research itself, but let's bring it back to the producers. What does this mean for them in practice? Can you share some strategies or considerations those working in the swine industry should keep in mind when making decisions based on this type of data?
Ultimately, our results would say that really the optimal strategy is going to be dependent on the parameters that you are most interested in. And so, as a generalization, if you're looking to optimize performance, so optimize individual performance of a sow or of a piglet. So if we think about having the lowest pre-weaning mortality and removals, or having the lowest sow body weight loss or highest piglet weaning weight, then a loading sows at 1 less pig than functional teat count or at teat count would be optimal in that situation to optimize individual performance. But if you're looking to maximize farm throughput, so the highest pigs weaned per litter, the highest litter weaning weight, and the highest pigs weaned per sow per year, then the +2 or loading sows at 2 more pigs than functional teat count is the optimal strategy according to the results of this trial. So it's really dependent on what's most important to each individual producer. And we know that ultimately producers are going to have different goals for their farm. And so this trial would tell us that there's not a one size fits all. And unfortunately, there's not a treatment where we get the best of everything. You're going to have some drawbacks either way you go. And so it's just important to pick the strategy that gives you the results that you're looking for on your farm.
And Abigail, as you think about then applying this into kind of the real world, so to speak, what are some keys to success for implementation of more pigs than teats?
That's a really good question. One of the things that I think was really paramount to the success of this trial and really lent itself to the results that we saw is a good entry sow body condition. So we got to conduct this trial with a really great farm crew that does a really great job of getting sows in good condition before they enter the farrowing house. So on average, these sows had about 15 millimeters of back fat, and less than 10% of them would have been classified as skinny based on PIC caliper recommendations. And so this was important because we believe that sows that enter the farrowing house that are in good condition are more resilient and ultimately better equipped to nurse more pigs than functional teats. So I would say that was a big key to success that we saw. Another thing that I think would be really important is teamwork and really just getting everybody on the same page about what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's important. I think that this can be said for a lot of SOPs on farm, that you've got to get buy-in from the farm crew, and they have to understand why it's important. And that's something that would be really important when you think about applying some of these different loading strategies. And then lastly, proactiveness is huge, especially when we think about loading sows with more pigs than functional teats, because at the end of the day, based on what we saw in farm, not every sow is going to be a +2 sow. And honestly, not every piglet is going to be able to thrive in a +2 litter. And so it really takes a farm crew that is really intentional and is really paying attention to these pigs, especially really early on. So, from about day 2 to day 7 is when we see the biggest percentage of removals in these pigs. And so some of those fall behind pigs that are gaunt in appearance. And so it takes a crew that is being really cognizant of a sow's limitations and pulling pigs off when those pigs obviously aren't doing well to ultimately save the most pigs. And so that's another thing to really keep in mind when you think about this trial, is that we did have a farm crew that was really good at identifying those fall behind pigs, and then they would have been fostered onto other sows and ultimately were able to thrive in that situation after they were moved off of their original sow. And so if you have a farm crew that's being really cognizant of a sow's limitations, you still have the opportunity to not only save that pig, but to also wean a full value pig. But that takes identifying these pigs early before they go downhill too much.
And then another question I wanted to make sure we chatted a little bit about too is, based on, the findings that you had, what do you feel need to be some next steps as far as research goes?
Um, that's a really great question. I know that in some other parts of the world, Denmark being one of those places, they are actually doing trials that are even greater number of pigs relative to functional teat count than this trial. So we're talking +3, +4, because that's just how big their litter sizes are. And so ultimately, I would say that a +2 loading strategy would probably be enough at this point in the US for our current litter sizes. But in the future, especially if we continue to increase litter size at the rate that we're going, then we might have to think about doing more studies where we look at even higher number of pigs relative to teat count. But I think in terms of trials that need to be conducted in the more near future, kind of going back to that supplemental nutrition, I think that that could be an interesting area as well, is to see if offering some intervention, whether that be supplemental milk or creep feeding, would ultimately have an impact on the results that we saw. Um, I I don't think that creep feeding would benefit our survivability much in the context of this trial, because when we look at the litter size over the lactation period, really where we see the biggest decline in litter size is going to be from the time of birth until about day 7. And then after about day 7, litter size is really going to plateau and remain really constant. And so we know that we're not going to get pigs using the creep feeder before day 7, typically in lactation. And so from a survivability standpoint, creep feeding might not benefit that, but it could ultimately help to improve weaning weights in some scenarios. But supplemental milk is something to consider. And it is also something that other countries like Denmark that have a much higher number of pigs born alive is currently researching. So those types of research would be important, I think, in the future.
That was a lot of valuable research to consider and a great reminder of how much is happening in the swine industry, from strategies producers and those working in the industry can implement to recognizing the essential role of farm crews in getting piglets off to a strong start. There is plenty to take away from today's conversation. A big thank you to Abigail Jenkins for helping us explore the question of how many pigs should a sow nurse, and to Dr. Joel DeRouchey for joining us and sharing his expertise. And thanks to all of you for tuning in as well. Be sure to join us next month for another timely topic and insightful look at all things swine. Until then, I'm Delaney Howell, and this has been the PigX Podcast.
PigX is a national podcast hosted by the Pig Livability Project partners at Iowa State University, Kansas State University, and Purdue, and supported by the Iowa Pork Industry Center. For more information on the project, head to www.piglivability.org, or to inquire directly with questions regarding the project, email ipic.iastate.edu. PigX, ideas in the swine industry worth sharing.